The first time I noticed them, I assumed I was misreading the photographs. Lower windows sealed with brick, doorways shortened halfway up the frame, staircases that seemed to begin one step too high, as though the floor beneath them had quietly risen, while no one was paying attention. In city after city, across continents that had never shared architects or municipal codes, the same alterations appeared again and again. At first, they looked mundane. Infrastructure upgrades, flood prevention, cosmetic redesigns layered onto aging buildings during the 19th century's relentless wave of modernization. Survey records framed them that way. Planning documents treated them as marginal notes, routine adjustments, filed and forgotten, but the dates refused to scatter. London, Hamburg, St. Petersburg, Boston, Buenos Aires. Renovation campaigns clustered within the same narrow band of decades, often within a single generation. Maps drawn before those years showed open ground floors where later additions displayed praised streets and buried entrances. Engineering notes referred to regrading without explaining where the removed earth went. Municipal budgets funded reconstruction without listing demolition costs that matched the volume implied. By the changes, archivists and surveyors surfaced only through their paperwork, distant silhouettes behind ink and stamps. Yet their records formed a pattern no individual city could explain on its own. The more locations I added, the harder coincidence became to defend. Somewhere in the early 19th century, entire urban landscapes had been lifted upward, and whatever caused it had been recorded so calmly that no one thought to ask why. 1816 arrived already carrying a name. Across Europe and North America, harvests failed beneath dimmed skies. Frost crept across fields in June. Snow fell where wheat should have been ripening. Diaries from farmers recorded ruined seasons with exhausted understatement. Shipping logs noted stalled trade routes. Naval journals tracked strange atmospheric haze drifting across oceans. Geologists would later connect the disruption to Mount Tambora's eruption the year before, a blast so violent it hurled ash into the upper atmosphere and altered global temperatures. The explanation made sense in broad strokes: sunlight blocked, weather distorted, crops lost. But when I placed that theory beside the buried streets from the previous chapter, something refused to line up. Volcanic winters scatter cold evenly. They do not pack meters of compacted soil into specific neighborhoods while leaving adjacent districts untouched. Ash falls broadly. Mud layers do not select basements. Engineering reports from the period described emergency grading campaigns, hurried drainage trenches, foundations rebuilt higher than before. Maps printed just a few years apart showed entire districts subtly lifted upward, as if the ground itself had been rewritten. Agricultural ledgers charted famine. Urban budgets charted reconstruction. Neither recorded the movement of earth on the scale implied by the altered streets. If the volcano dimmed the sun, something else seemed to have reshaped the cities. And whatever that was, it had done so quickly enough that new maps replaced old ones before anyone paused to ask what lay beneath. The paper trail should have made everything simpler. Instead, it fractured. Municipal archives that preserved decades of budget reports suddenly skipped entire years. Census ledgers restarted without explanation. Survey tables referred to excavation work that never appeared in shipping. Registers or quarry logs, clerks and librarians surfaced only through margin notes, crossed-out totals, and approval stamps that led nowhere. I began listing what was missing. Soil transfer receipts that should have accompanied regrading projects. Harbor dredging records that ought to explain where sediment was dumped. Rail manifests that tracked timber and coal in obsessive detail, yet said nothing about millions of tons of earth. In city after city, the same pattern repeated. Reconstruction documented, material movement absent, maps revised, invoices incomplete. What unsettled me was not a single lost document. It was geography. The gaps clustered in the same districts, where basements had been sealed and streets raised. Different governments, different bureaucracies, Identical blind spots. Absence stopped looking accidental. It began to look procedural. If so much ground had truly been moved, someone had authorized it. And somewhere, the records of that decision were no longer where they should be. Digging reports changed the texture of the investigation. Canal crews cutting new channels recorded striking compacted layers several feet below modern street level. Railway engineers described shovel blades hitting dense strata, where maps insisted there should be nothing but to fill. Cellar excavations exposed intact door frames, sealed in earth, windowsills pressed flat beneath sediment heavy enough to bow old masonry. The language in those reports was careful. Measurements, depth charts, cross-sections sketched in the margins. No speculation, only geometry. Staircases truncated mid-flight. Floor tiles preserved beneath packed soil. Brick courses ending abruptly, as though construction had paused and never resumed. Workers and foremen surfaced only through the words attributed to them in local newspapers. Quoted indirectly, their astonishment filtered into neutral columns of print. Inspectors added stamped approvals. Municipal engineers recalculated foundation loads and raised new basements above the old. What mattered was not one site. It was how many. The projects separated by oceans described nearly identical profiles, dense layers, sharp boundaries, rapid rebuilding schedules. Districts reopened within months, not years. Even when the buried volumes implied vast removal efforts, earlier gaps in paperwork returned with new significance. If so much material had been excavated, transported, and redeposited, the logistics should have been overwhelming. Yet the ledgers stayed thin. The deeper the trenches went, the harder, slow, natural accumulation became to defend. Once the digging reports were set aside, the story flattened itself onto paper. Maps, city plans, property registries, pre-event engravings showed courtyards open to daylight, stairways descending cleanly to street level, door thresholds aligned with sidewalks that no longer existed. Later editions raised the grid lines, renumbered districts, erased lower floors with neat revisions that implied intention rather than improvisation. Cartographers replaced laborers as the visible actors in the record. Survey boards issued updated elevations. Ministries approved new zoning lines that treated altered ground levels as if they had always been that way. What unsettled me was how quickly those changes propagated. Atlas plates engraved only a few years apart contradicted each other in quiet, technical ways. Street profiles lifted by a meter, alleys shortened, entire blocks compressed vertically without comment. Bureaucracy moved faster than geology. Transportation routes were adjusted in parallel. River dredging projects redirected channels toward newly defined embankments. Harbor expansions buried earlier docks beneath reclaimed ground. Canal corridors were redrawn as though sediment shifts had been anticipated rather than endured. The paperwork never argued, and it simply replaced. And when I overlaid these revisions across borders, the pattern widened. Multiple administrations, working independently, appeared to have rewritten their cities at nearly the same moment, not reacting, standardizing, as if something beneath the streets had forced everyone to agree on a new version of reality. By the time I stepped beyond Europe and North America, coincidence had lost its last refuge. Engineering, dig logs from coastal ports in Asia, described dense layers sealing stone foundations that should have remained exposed. Railway cuttings in Australia reported compacted strata interrupting planned grades. River dredging accounts from South America listed extraordinary volumes removed from channels that had not flooded within living memory. Different continents, different governments, the same geometry beneath their cities. Shipping registers and colonial construction orders replaced atlases as primary evidence, revealing frantic material movement after the same narrow cluster of years. Cubic totals calculated from those projects exceeded what storms or landslides normally leave behind. Local disasters scattered debris. These figures implied relocation. At scale, emotions shifted as the arithmetic accumulated. Unease hardened into something heavier, a quiet realization that hemispheres do not mirror one another by accident. Only then did I begin encountering a term circulating on the edges of amateur literature: mudflood. I treated it as a placeholder, nothing more, a name awaiting proof, because what mattered was not the word, it was how far the pattern now reached. At that stage, the investigation stopped expanding outward and began folding in on itself. Every plausible mechanism had to pass the same threshold. Earthquakes were examined first. Seismological reconstructions mapped fault lines active during the early 19th century, estimating displacement and liquefaction zones. The figures never approached the volumes excavated beneath, rebuilt. Districts, ground motion fractures, foundations. It does not bury entire floors intact. Glacial melt pulses were next. Hydrological models showed flooding potential downstream from retreating ice, yet the sediment signatures did not behave like river deposits. Flood layers taper. They spread. They mix. What appeared beneath cities was dense, abrupt, vertically bounded. Industrial dumping offered another candidate. Early factories produced slag and spoil, but production records remained modest compared to the cubic calculations emerging from canal cuts and harbor dredging. Even coordinated waste removal would have required fleets and manpower that left almost no logistical footprint. Reports accumulated quietly. Engineering memoranda, scientific bulletins, policy board summaries written in restrained prose. Each explanation absorbed a fragment of the data and then failed somewhere else. The volcanic winter narrative thinned under the same scrutiny. Ash clouds account for cooling. They do not account for stone staircases, sealed under meters of compacted earth. What remained were variables no report seemed willing to pursue at scale. Timing clusters, simultaneous rebuilding orders, jurisdictional overlaps, the rewriting of maps and ledgers occurring alongside frantic construction campaigns. The evidence was not converging on a single cause. It was converging on coordination, and I was still not prepared to say by whom. The pattern did not stop at construction sites or ledger books. It continued behind desks. In museum accession logs, artifacts recovered during redevelopment phases were described in softened language: relocated masonry, subsurface irregularities, foundation realignment, terms that implied routine rather than rupture. In planning offices, internal memoranda reframed buried flaws as design updates, their origins folded into long-term modernization programs rather than emergency response. I began following classification numbers instead of locations. Restricted shelving codes appeared again and again. Archival requests marked incomplete. Collections transferred between departments, with no public catalog entries attached. The names of the people involved rarely surfaced. What remained were processes, procedures, templates. One set of minutes from a municipal review committee devoted 3 lines to an excavation that displaced thousands of cubic meters of compacted soil beneath a civic building. The surrounding pages discussed street lighting upgrades in meticulous detail. The imbalance was striking, not theatrical, administrative. In correspondence between academic societies, anomalies were reduced through careful phrasing. Questions were narrowed. Definitions tightened. Entire categories of findings were absorbed into technical subclauses that made follow-up appear unnecessary. I caught myself rereading sentences, checking whether I had missed the admission. I had not. Across borders, the same linguistic compression surfaced, different governments, different bureaucracies, identical tonal gravity wells pulling disruption inward until it became procedural noise. No orders announcing suppression, only filing systems that rendered certain things unremarkable. The earlier gaps in soil transfer records, the revised atlases, the accelerated rebuilding programs, all fit more cleanly now. Reconstruction had not only reshaped streets, it had reorganized attention, and once that realization settled, another followed behind it. If the ground had been rewritten, and the paperwork had been rewritten, then the long-term record would not need to lie. It would only need to forget, quietly, By this point, the individual anomalies no longer behaved like isolated curiosities. Buried floors, redrawn streets, truncated stairwells, administrative silences, accelerated rebuilding campaigns, softened terminology inside archives. Each could be examined on its own and dismissed with effort. Together, they formed a structure that resisted being taken apart. I began laying timelines side by side. Urban renovations clustered within the same decades that shipping manifests thinned. Census revisions coincided with sudden elevation changes on municipal plats. Museum catalog numbers drifted into restricted classifications during the same years that emergency ordinances multiplied across port authorities and inland capitals alike. None of it required dramatic coordination to appear unsettling. Only repetition. Across continents, the same sequence unfolded: disruption, reconstruction, reclassification, normalization. The institutions remained different, the processes did not. What unsettled me most was not any single omission, but the way omissions accumulated without colliding. They nested inside one another. Engineering reports avoided historical speculation. Cartographers updated elevations without explanation. Archivists preserved the paperwork while severing the context that gave it weight. At some point, the investigation stopped expanding outward and began folding back on itself. If these resets had occurred once, could they have occurred before? And if similar episodes were unfolding now, distributed across jurisdictions and generations, would they even register as anomalies? Or would they already be archived under something else? I returned to the same places where the investigation had started. Basement windows half submerged behind sidewalks, staircases that descended into walls, door frames whose proportions no longer matched the streets built around them, features so common they had faded into background texture, absorbed into daily movement and municipal maintenance schedules. They felt different now, not mysterious in isolation, heavier. Every truncated floor carried the accumulated weight of earlier chapters, the volcanic winter records that could not fully account for selective burial, the vanished soil manifests, the atlases revised within a single generation, the filing systems that rendered disruption ordinary through repetition and euphemism. None of it demanded a single explanation to remain unsettling. It only required proximity. When you stand on a street that has been raised once, maybe twice, the question is not what lies below. It is how much was moved, and by whom. Logistics intrude where speculation used to sit. Transport networks capable of relocating entire districts, labor forces mobilized at continental scale, jurisdictional permissions issued across borders, while archives thinned in parallel. These are not dramatic operations. They are administrative ones, quiet, procedural, distributed across committees and decades until no individual decision carries the shape of the whole. The earth does not relocate itself, and cities rarely rewrite themselves without paper following behind. What unsettles me now is not the possibility of a forgotten catastrophe, but the resilience of the systems that absorbed it. The way disruption becomes zoning law, the way emergency ordinances fossilize into planning doctrine, the way sediment becomes foundation, and foundation becomes memory. Modern streets continue to rise. Infrastructure continues to be replaced. Subsurface layers accumulate beneath neighborhoods whose residents rarely ask what earlier streets they walk above. Perhaps the same questions remain unanswered because they were never designed to be answered all at once. Perhaps they were meant to be dispersed across offices, across generations, across cities still inhabited by people who assume the ground beneath them has always been where it is. I no longer look at pavement the same way. Not because it hides something extraordinary, because it might hide something administrative, and that, I'm beginning to suspect, is far more durable.